I was born in New York City in 1929 from Dutch Jewish immigrant parents who unfortunately in 1932, when I was 3 years old, decided to move back to Amsterdam, Holland. I said unfortunately because that was just about the time they started to talk about a man by the name of Adolf Hitler, although nobody seemed to take him very seriously. So we moved to Amsterdam, we settled down to a normal, happy, peaceful life. I went to school, forgot the little English I knew as a young American boy. Everything was just fine until May 10th, 1940, when I was 10 years old. Hitler's armies invaded, amongst other countries, the Netherlands. The whole battle took 5 days, and suddenly we found ourselves living in an occupied country. At first things were quite normal, but gradually more and more of our civil rights were taken away, particularly those of the Jewish people. One of the first things that happened is that all the students in the schools were given a questionnaire to take home with them, to be filled out by their parents and to be returned the next day to the school. And that question was, how many Jewish grandparents do you have? We filled it out, didn't think much of it. It was more or less like a census at the time, and we took it back to school. But the Germans kept very careful records of all those things, and a few weeks later orders came out that anyone with 2 or more Jewish grandparents was considered a Jew and would have to start wearing a large yellow Jewish star. And we had to wear this on all our clothing over our hearts so that we could be easily identified. Now, with the order to start wearing a star also came a lot of other orders. As Jewish children, we were no longer permitted to play with or even talk to Christian children. We had to go to separate schools. All Jewish people had to be in off the street at 8 o'clock at night. We had to turn in our radios, bicycles, telephones, weren't allowed to ride streetcars, buses, trains, couldn't go to the movies, weren't even allowed in a public park. In most stores we were not allowed in. They had signs on the windows, such as this one, for Joden verboden, which is also Dutch and means in English, for Jews not permitted. When we arrived in Amsterdam in 1932, my mother, thank God, had the foresight to register me every other year with the American consul in order for me to keep my American citizenship. Had she not done that, I would have lost my citizenship and I would not be here this morning talking to you. And when the order came out for all Jews to start wearing a star, I received a letter from the Swiss consul, who was representing the American consul during the war. They had returned to the United States. And this letter from the Swiss consul stated that because of my American citizenship, I don't have to wear this star. So of course this gave me a certain amount of privileges. The next thing the Nazis started with, and I do refer to them mostly as Nazis, not so much as Germans, because not all Germans were Nazis, and as a matter of fact not all Nazis were German. The next thing they started with was so-called razzias. Now, razzie is a German word for roundup, and they would do this by blocking off a certain area of the city. Nobody could get in, nobody could get out, and they would systematically go from door to door, and anyone seen wearing a Jewish star was arrested, put into waiting trucks, taken away, and we never saw them again. One of those razzias took place in my own neighborhood one morning. I was 12 years old, and like any young boy, I was curious to see what was going on. So I went downstairs in the street, and remember, I was not wearing a star. And a few minutes later, 3 members of the Grüne Polizei, the German military police, with machine guns, approached my house, went upstairs, and 10 minutes later, at gunpoint, took away my father and mother. Right in front of me, and there was nothing I could do about it. I remember one of the Grüne Polizei had a machine gun in my mother's back, and as he's pushing into this truck, he's yelling at him and saying, "Ruhe, ich schieße! If you move, I'll shoot." And they were taken away. I'm sure I don't have to tell you how scared I was. I didn't know what to do. And then I thought maybe the Swiss consul might be able to help me. So I called him and I told him my father and mother had been arrested. Would he please try to do something? And he said he would try. And that night they released my mother and sent her home. But my father was sent to the Westerbork concentration camp in Holland, And the next day my mother and I went to see the Swiss consul and pleaded with him, please see what you can do for my father. And again he said he would try. And 10 days later they released my father from the concentration camp. He was given a release paper, a very rare document, because I've never heard of anyone ever being released from a concentration camp. And it says, and listen to this, it doesn't say Mr. Spanjaard, it says the Jew, Alfred Spanjaard, is released from concentration camp Westerbork based on the request from the Swiss consul because he's the father of a minor American citizen. So for a while we kind of lived under a false sense of security. I didn't have to wear a star, my mother had been sent home, my father had been released from the camp, and we really didn't see the need to go into hiding even if we could have found a place, which was something of course very difficult. For a few months everything was all right, until April 6, 1943, I was 13 years old. Suddenly, without warning, at 2 o'clock in the morning, our front door was kicked in. Again, 3 members of the Grüne Polizei with machine guns yelling at us, telling us to get ready to come with them in 10 minutes. Now, in 10 minutes, you can't pack a lot of things. And from that moment on, for the next 2 years, I was not to hear a kind, warm, friendly word from a stranger again. We were sent to Westerbork, the camp my father had been in a few months prior to that. At the beginning of the war, there were approximately 120,000 Jewish people living in Holland. The Nazis managed to arrest about 105,000 of us. They were all taken to Westerbork, a so-called transit camp, kept there for 2 or 3 days, long enough to be registered, have their jewelry taken away, have their life insurance policies and bank accounts signed over to the Nazis, and then they were put in cattle cars and sent to extermination camps in Poland. But they kept my mother and my father and I there for almost a year. We had no idea why. Until February 1st, 1944, we received word that we were to be sent to Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp in northern Germany. We had never heard of the camp, but they assured us we would be much happier there. They were always very clever. Whenever there was a mass transport of people, in order to avoid problems, they would tell you, well, where we're sending you, you'll be happy. And they told us we would be living in better barracks, and the barracks would be heated, and the food would be better. I could hardly wait to get there. They put us in cattle cars that were left over from the First World War and had stenciled outside in French, 8 chevaux, 40 hommes, meaning 8 horses or 40 people. But they shoved about 70 of us in each one of these cattle cars, slammed the door shut, sealed them so nobody could get out. We had a little straw on the floor, a little pail was a toilet for 70 people. And we spent 48 hours under these horrible conditions being transported from Holland to Germany. When we finally arrived there 2 days and 2 nights later, the SS men were waiting for us with police dogs, and the men were yelling at us, "Raus, raus, los, schnell, get out fast." There was an elderly gentleman laying next to me, and I shook his shoulder and said, "Come on, you better get up, they want us to get out." Well, he never got up. He had died during the night, as had 12 others in my particular boxcar alone, including 4 young children. They had died from lack of air, nothing to eat, nothing to drink, the cold, or just being scared. They marched us through the snow for 2 hours until we arrived in Bergen-Belsen. They told us this was a privileged camp. What were some of the privileges? First of all, we were not tattooed on the forearm with identification numbers, as they did in Auschwitz, like you do with cattle around here. Secondly, families were not separated. In all the other camps, when families arrived, the children were immediately taken away from the parents, and the men separated from the women, and they never saw each other again. In our camp, they didn't do that. The men slept in men's barracks, the women in women's barracks, but we did see each other every day. And the third privilege, and of course the most important one, was the fact that Bergen-Belsen was not an extermination camp. It had not been built to specifically, systematically kill people. Now that didn't prevent over 50,000 people from dying there anyway, from starvation, slave labor, beatings, diseases, hopelessness, So let me tell you a little bit about the life there.